Hello there. This is my recording for personality psychology on this section. This should be the second class, and we're going to be talking about how we know what we know about personality. As you guys should know from the last class period, my name is Felix Smith. I go by Felix, but you can call me Dr. Smith if you're feeling all formal like. And as I said last time, my training is in the clinical end of psychology. So a lot of my focus tends to be a bit more applied than some other folks. Now, today we're talking about how we know what we know. Essentially research methods. Now, this is one of those areas where there is a little bit of a trap. And the trap is the guy sitting at this end of the table. I am really interested in research methods. I find it absolutely fascinating. I love the idea of epistemology, and my experience is a lot of students find it a little bit weird and frustrating. And a lot of the time we teach it in a way that doesn't do it justice. So what I want you to be thinking about is, firstly, I'm trying to balance that problem. But secondly, I want you to be thinking about what this essentially is thinking about the relative quality of information. The relative quality of the information that we're making judgments on based on what we know about personality. Now, I'm going to make the assumption that I think evidence is going to be the best thing. Evidence is always better than supposition. So we're weighing different kinds of evidence. My line is always most of the philosophical questions that I come across are very frequently empirical questions. I don't really care what you think, I care what you can prove. So we get to how do we examine personality. Now, before I get to that, I want to think of a caveat. One of the caveats is, well, even within psychology, there are psychologists who don't really believe in personality. We have this idea of a personality as this set of innate traits that to some degree are stable over time. One of the things that often we don't like to talk about in social psychology and personality psychology is that in certain kinds of situations there isn't a lot of stability in people's behavior. Situations are very, very powerful. Hardcore behaviorists would do sometimes make the argument there's no such thing in personality, and that's something we're going to argue about more. But we want to be thinking about this idea when we think about the ambiguity of some of the indicators that we use. How some of the indicators can be ambiguous and it's difficult to discern what they mean, because sometimes you get to a conclusion that you don't like. And if the evidence says, well, there's no such thing as personality, geez, what are you guys doing? Then this stops being a psych class and starts being a history class. Now, I would argue that the evidence says that there is such a thing. But in the service of thinking about research methods, we always have to keep that idea in the back of my head. What if we're completely wrong about this? What if we're chasing down a rabbit hole? Now, last class I gave the example, I was talking about latent variables. We talked about reflective latent variables which something is invisible and we're trying to produce indicators, we're trying to find indicators to see what this thing is. You can't see personality, but you're looking for its footprints. And I used the example of sometimes it's like shooting paintballs at the invisible man. If personality is a true reflective variable, we'll be able to see it in a bunch of these different indicators. And as I mentioned a moment ago, when you look at just one of these indicators, they can be pretty ambiguous. It can be pretty hard to tell what one individual piece of information means. So, with all of these things, we're looking for convergent information, convergent validity. We're looking at different indicators showing us the same thing. If they're not showing us the same thing, maybe we're asking the wrong questions. But we want to be seeing these convergent lines of evidence coming together. When we look at things from the bottom up, we should see the same as we see from the top down. So, I want to think of some examples of indicators. One example I think of comes from an argument I had with a friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Kevin Young, and he and I went to graduate school together, and we spent an awful lot of time talking about this stuff because we were both very interested in it. And we found ourselves obsessed, that's too strong a word, very interested in the MMPI. The MMPI is a measure of personality. It's a pencil and paper test. You fill it out, check yes or no, and then we use the aggregation, we use the adding up of those answers to tell something about a person. How we do that is by comparing it to how previous people have completed it and what those previous completions of it have told us. Now, the MMPI is what we call both a rational instrument and an empirically derived instrument. It's rational. Rational means that we've thought about it, we've made a decision based on rational thinking. So, for example, a bunch of the questions about substance abuse on the MMPI, we looked at all the questions on substance abuse and went, they're about substance abuse. We should use those to find out about substance abuse. On the other hand, a bunch of these questions are empirical. What that means is we ask the question, we have a bunch of people answer it, we look at those people's lives, and we see what it hangs together with, we see what it correlates with. One of the most useful questions on the MMPI is a one item, and it's 500 odd items. One of those 500 odd items, the item that's the most effective for predicting schizophrenic symptoms, and it tends to be positive schizophrenic symptoms, the more active ones rather than the deficits that a lot of schizophrenics show. And also showing a lot of antisocial, it's the same question also predicts antisocial behaviour. By antisocial, I don't mean non-social, I don't mean not being interested in social activities, I mean actively breaking rules, disregarding people's rights, being actively antisocial. Turns out one question predicts those best of all. Now, here's the problem. I kind of have to lie to you about what the question is. The reason is, as I mentioned, this idea of test security. The idea is, if we tell you about the MMPI, it stops working. So I'm not going to give you the exact question, but I'm going to give you a question that's a lot like it, so you can understand what I'm talking about. That question is, I enjoy reading books about military history. The people who say endorse that item, the people who say, yep, that's true about me, that item, for one item, significantly predicts active schizophrenic symptoms, significantly predicts antisocial behaviour. Why is that? Well, Dr. Young's answer was I don't care. It does, it works. Why would I argue with that? It works, that's a really useful thing. If you saying yes to this gives me useful information to predict your behaviour in the future, why do I care how? But we do, don't we? In this case, what we're seeing is, firstly, one item alone, even the best one item predictor isn't very powerful on its own. And what I think is happening here is it's a marker for something else. Answering yes to that indicates other variables that co-occur with it. Now, an example of this would be I like military books. I like reading about military history. And that probably hangs together with being male. And when you look at antisocial behaviour, males are way more likely to engage in antisocial behaviour than women are. Now, are we just asking this question? What this question is really asking is, are you probably male as opposed to probably female? That brings us to the importance of knowing. Because although the evidence shows that predicts something, that might not be what it's really about. Now, let me give you a more concrete and useful example of this. I'm going to tell you about a scale, a predictive tool called the static 99. Specifically, I'm talking about the static 99R, which is the revised version of this. And the static 99 is a measure of recidivism. We have two kinds of ways of measuring recidivism. We're interested in static factors and dynamic factors. By recidivism, I mean the chance that someone will reoffend. That's a pretty high stakes game with something like sex offending, right? You really want to, but you haven't got enough resources, never got enough resources for treatment, you've never got enough resources for law enforcement. So you want to be putting your resources in the best place. It's not nice, but it's true. Now, static risks are risks that are unchangeable. If you committed your first offence at the age of 15, you can't go back in time and change that. The number of previous offences is static, it's not changing. Your capacity to cope with the stresses of your life is dynamic, that can change. Your life situation, are you in jail, are you not in jail, that can change. The static 99 only measures static measures, only measures static risk. And that's a little proviso. Now, I was thinking about this and I found myself thinking, is this really a measure of personality? In the way that a lot of the time we think about personality, no. But we're talking about a cluster of traits and behaviours and feelings that have an effect in the real world and appear to be stable over time. I think we're talking about some of the same characteristics. Is it Freudian stages of development? No. Is it a useful application of this body of knowledge? Yes. Now, what I'm going to do is, hopefully in a second, it should appear on the screen, I'm going to show you the list of questions on the static 99. Part of the reason I'm doing this is I can't show you the MMPI. I can show you the static 99. Because it's static variables, knowing the answers could change the responses a person might give. So here are the first 5 items, and in a second it will flip across to the second 5 items. We have the person's age at their release, if they've ever lived with somebody for longer than 2 years. The index offence refers to the current events the person is incarcerated for. Is there any? So question 3 is asking: is there any violence to the current conviction? Has there been prior non-sexual violence? How many previous charges or convictions, whichever's higher, they've had for a sex offence? How many specific sentencing dates they've had in the past? So what that means is the number of times they've come in, stood in court, and they said, right, you go to jail or you don't. Then we get into some of the more interesting questions. And they're interesting because they appear to be markers for things. Has the person been convicted of any non-contact sexual offences? Do they have any victims that are unrelated to them? Unrelated means not an immediate first or a family member. Do they have any victims that are strangers? Now, what that means is, have they known the victim for more than 24 hours? Are any of their victims male? And then you simply go through, you answer each of those questions about that person. In order to do this, I don't even have to meet them. I can just go through their record. And I check and I add up the scores. And -3 through 1 is a low score, 2 or 3 is low moderate, 4 or 5 is high moderate, 6 or more is high. And depending on different areas, the different populations I've worked with, you see different ranges of scores. When you work in outpatient clinics, you see an awful lot of 1s, 2s and 3s. I briefly visited one setting where they were working with people who were having death sentence appeals, and they never got anyone through the door who wasn't carrying an 8 or a 9 on the static 99. Now, why would I bother scoring static 99? What does that tell me about people? Well, what I can do is I can plot over time, I can do studies. I can go back through police records, and it turns out Carl Hansen dead. That's Carl, not Chris. Chris is the guy on the TV. Carl Hansen works for the Solicitor General's office in Canada, and is one of the biggest sex offender researchers in the world. Well, top 5. What they did was they went through all their police records. They worked out people's static 99 scores, and they looked at the time between their offence and their next offence. They looked at how long it took them to recidivate. And then what they did was they worked out how likely a person with a given score is to recidivate at a given time. So I should have them on the screen now. We can see if your score is -3, your 10-year recidivism rate is about 3%. However, if your score is 8, and 8 would be extremely high risk, that will be a person who has been convicted multiple times, has probably been diagnosed, probably has some sort of paraphilic interest, probably has crimes against strangers, against males, against all of these risk factors. That person has a really, really high 70% chance of recidivism within the next 10 years. This is the power of empiricism. I can make judgments based on this. One of the perils you find about making judgments about people is not having a good metric. You look at people and you go, well, he seems like a nice guy, or he doesn't seem like a nice guy. You think about the judgments you make in your everyday life. What kind of a person is this? Will I let this person be my friend? What this lets me do is back up my opinions with evidence. It lets me make a series of structured judgments about a person that are based on gathered evidence that's been gathered through a scientific method, and make judgments about whether or not this person needs to be locked up for the rest of their life. Make judgments about whether or not this person should be allowed to go to an outpatient setting, or whether or not this person shouldn't. This gives me a whole bunch of valid and useful information about how to allocate my resources. Given that it costs, $40,000, $60,000 to keep a person in prison, this is pretty useful. And I figure somebody is thinking this question, because they usually do. The question I often get asked is about 7, 8, 9, and 10. Why are there questions about having convictions for non-contact offences, for having stranger or unrelated victims, or for having any male victims? These, on the one hand, why are they there? They're there because when you ask that question, these people who have done that are way more likely to reoffend. What it seems like is it's a marker of an underlying process. It's a thing, an indicator that indicates probably heightened levels of sexual dysfunction. More and more powerful sexual urges, and more the non-contact offences. A person who engages in non-contact offences, for example, voyeurism, very frequently has engaged in a whole bunch of voyeuristic or sexual-based offences before they reach a contact offence. So what we see is, that's a strong indicator of an invisible underlying process that's leading a person towards a behaviour. These are harder rules to break. I'll leave that there. So, we want to link underlying latent variables, invisible things, to real-world things that we can actually measure. As I said last time, you can't get a handful of personality, not even with a bone saw. And we want answers to questions that are real. We want to be able to hold these things in our hand. Now, we have 4 basic sources of evidence when we talk about personality. When we're talking about measuring underlying invisible parts of a person, 4 basic ideas. We can ask you, we can ask your friends, or your loved ones, or your family, or the people around you. We can look at life outcomes. We can look at where you actually wound up. And we can do studies in controlled conditions. But back to convergence, because all of these have advantages and all of these have disadvantages. And one of my big bugbears is I hear again and again from folks, they'll read a study and they'll say, oh, well, this doesn't really tell anything because you just ask people stuff and you just asked a whole bunch of people stuff and they could be lying and they could be this and you really don't think we thought of that? You really don't think that these quite clever people with a whole bunch of PhDs floating around doing personality research didn't work out that somebody might lie to them? Turns out, yeah, but we balance these different kinds of research. We balance their strengths and weaknesses. And you know what? If the only evidence was what people said, yeah, that'd be a problem. So let's think about self-report. You ask people stuff, and man, you would be surprised what people tell you if you ask them. Working as a clinician, one of the things that never ceases to amaze me is in a specific situation that pulls for it, the secrets that are the important things about them that a person will tell you. Also, it never ceases to amaze me the important information that people won't tell you if you don't specifically ask the right question. So there's a double-edged sword there. But it makes kind of sense. Who's the best expert on you other than you? It's face valid. Face validity means that a thing seems as it seems. Road safety is face valid. Most of the rules of road safety: look both ways before you cross the road, cross at the crosswalk, cross with other when you're a kid, cross with other people. All of those things you look at and go, yeah, those will make you safer. Those things are face valid. As I said, you know yourself. More than that, our self-image affects our behaviour. If you think of yourself as the kind of person who is kind, and you walk past the guy panhandling in the street, and you walk past and you feel, well, but I feel like I'm the guy who's kind. That may change your behaviour in that situation. Our self-image has this self-reinforcing, self-focusing effect. And the truth is, it's easy and convenient. We could get a publishable. We could get a publishable study in a couple of weeks. We sit down, we write a couple of questions. We walk into my intro to psych class. We give my intro to psych class those questions. We come on back and we say, "What did they say?" Well, they said this. That's usable psychological data. We should probably do a little bit more thinking about it before we just run in there and start asking them stuff. We should probably plan it out, do all our due diligence beforehand. But it's that easy to get data that you can do something with. There is a value to having a lot of data. There's risks to it too, but there's a value to having a lot of data. As data sets get larger, error evens out. The error of the one guy reading the one item on the one test going, I'm not sure if I'm true or false. Once we've asked him 500 questions and asked 500 people, there's 500 questions. That shakes out. We're not putting enough focus on that one question for it to screw us up. It's useful. But maybe you lie to me. People lie to me all the time. I run substance abuse treatment groups. The number of people who lie to me. No, I haven't used anything in ages. I get lied to all the time. More than that, you might not know yourself. We have failures in self-perception all of the time. The number of people who I meet who, let's use a substance abuse example, tell me they're at low risk for a relapse. No, I haven't used in ages. I'll be fine, I haven't used in ages. And you look at their background history, you look at these kinds of empirical indicators, and yeah, they're at really, really high risk. There's a specific example of this that some of you may have heard of called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Very briefly, what Dunning and Kruger found was that, well, let me put it this way. If you've ever had a job, you've probably had a manager. And most managers are excellent and wonderful and fine, but most of you probably by now had a job with a manager who was an idiot. And you knew he was an idiot, and he didn't. And he or she kept telling you to do dumb stuff, and you're sitting there tearing your hair out going, why are you so foolish? What Dunning-Kruger found was those people, the people who are really bad at their jobs, most of them, the reason why they're bad at their jobs is because they don't know what looking good, doing good at their job even looks like. They can't improve because they don't have an image of what doing good at it would be. So what happens? They don't want to think they're an idiot, so they just assume they're doing good and trundle through their lives going do. What they found, though, was the people who were good at their jobs doubted whether or not they were good at their jobs. Frequently. This failure in self-perception causes people's performance to degrade terribly. And of course it's very hard to tell them, I'm terribly sorry you're terrible at your job, you've been terrible for ages. People don't like to hear that. So it's a very useful effect to be aware of, especially in those long dark nights when you're sitting there going, geez, can I do this at all? If you're asking that, you're probably not as bad off as those guys. And as I mentioned, the problem of overuse and over-reliance, it's easy, so we use it. Self-report data is easy. Because it's easy, we use it too much. And you should be careful of a phenomena that are only known about through self-report. So, let's think about others' report. Again, this is a step. It's cheap and easy. It's a little bit less cheap. It's a little bit harder. You got to run down a dude, and then you got to run down two dudes who know that dude in order to get your answer. But it's ecologically valid. Now, what I mean by ecologically valid, I mean that rather than just being face valid, where you look at it and go, well, that looks like it's valid, ecological validity, sometimes called external validity, is the extent at which the thing that we are talking about is likely to generalize into the wider world. If I know that you can make 5 widgets a minute when I'm sitting there watching you do it, maybe you can do 5 widgets a minute when you're sitting in a factory with nobody watching. Maybe you can't. The extent to which you can, the extent to which that information is true, is how ecologically valid it is. And other report is ecologically valid because that's a person out there in the world. What people think of them is a part of this phenomena of personality. There's also a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Now, the classic idea of self-fulfilling prophecy comes from two folks called Rosenthal and Jacobson. And the quintessential example that they had was they went into a school, they gave the kids IQ tests, they took the IQ test data, they threw it out, they randomly picked a couple of kids out of the hat, they told the teachers that these kids are going to be geniuses. It's not showing yet, but these kids are going to be geniuses. They didn't actually throw the data out because they needed it to compare to the next time. They came back, they tested the kids again. The kids that they'd identified as geniuses, who they picked randomly, gone up, doing better, performing better across the board. The way people expect you to act affects how you expect to act. Look at our situation. I'm insulated from it somewhat because I'm sitting there talking to a camera. But sitting in the room, me at the front, you sitting in class, in chairs in class, has a pull on your behaviour. The expectation of how you're supposed to act in class, your expectation about what kind of a student am I? If you're sitting in the honours college, you probably have an image of yourself as a good student. That will probably impact your behaviour in class. My perception of you as a good student will affect the amount of respect I treat you with. And that will affect the amount of respect you treat me with. It's plunged into the puzzle. But the problem with asking other people about a person is they're not you. They're not living inside your skin, they're not thinking your thoughts, they don't know your true inner motivation. There's an argument there about whether or not they'll know it better than you. But then again, I'm a behaviourist. There are, however, elements of bias effects. People are vulnerable to all sorts of heuristic biases and errors in judgment. Extreme examples are always more memorable. This is kind of an unusual situation right here. There's a good chance that the thing that you may remember me for, at least for the next month, is that dude who gave his lectures by video camera. That's a pretty unusual example. A more unusual example is physical aggression. If anyone's been physically aggressive with us, we pay more attention to that than the number of times they may have been nice to us. And these biases can come from all sorts of different sources and really colour the way that you think about them. My example I often think of is you ask what the students who got an A in my class last year think of me. Felix is clever, he's smart, he's wonderful. You ask the students who got an F, Felix is a terrible teacher and he's smelly and he eats babies. That bias of experience can impinge on our capacity to correctly look at what other people are doing and infer those indicators from within them. My favourite is life indicators. Because again, empiricism, Felix is weird, etc., etc., etc. And the truth of it is, as I mentioned with running substance abuse groups, people lie to me all the time. And a lot of the time they don't know that they're lying to me. They're not making a conscious choice, they're just letting their self-presentation biases take over. The number of times I've talked to somebody and said, how many times have you got in trouble with the law? One or two. I pull up OTIS, which is the Michigan Department of Corrections system for measuring, Michigan Department of Corrections online system for displaying people's criminal records. I look it up, and they've got this one and this one, and you ask them, I forgot about that. That one. That one. Yeah, I completely forgot. They're not lying to me. It just doesn't fit their self-image, so it gets edited out. Being able to link things directly to outcomes is critical because it's concrete and reliable. Again, I gave you my MMPI example earlier. We match that to stuff. Static 99. Static 99 gives me a good idea of your behaviour in the future. Give me a real outcome to measure. The problem, of course, is everything is multiply determined. By which I mean almost everything has more than one cause. A person who is more introverted than another person isn't introverted because of the one thing or one person said to them one time. They're introverted because of a variety of factors. Some of them internal and genetic or biological. Some of them experiential, things that happen to them over the course of their life. Some of them an interaction between the two. A more introverted person finds themselves avoiding social experiences, leading to them to have less social experiences and thus less social skills and thus become more introverted. These things interact, they're complicated, and if we look at any given life outcome, personality is not going to be the only cause in it. There's going to be all sorts of factors bleeding into them. We trade reliability and validity. Reliability is how reliable a measure is. How we check it again, and the commonality between those two times. Good personality measure should be reliable. We should try it once, we should get a similar result the next time, similar result the next time, similar result the next time. But frequently, those kinds of measures that are reliable, when we use them, by their nature, we lose some validity. If I ask you yes/no questions, my results are going to be very, very reliable. Hopefully, if I've written them well. But they may not be valid because I didn't ask you that thing I needed to ask you. Or I didn't ask you about that thing that you wanted to tell me, or I didn't ask you about. So, frequently these things can be reliable, but they're not necessarily valid. Or they're not necessarily getting at the other things that may have caused or assisted in causing this thing. Finally, of the four, we've got studies in controlled conditions. Now, These might be naturalistic observations, or they might be experimentation. Experimentation is the bread and butter of psychology. That will be why they call one of the areas of psychology experimental psychology. Naturalistic observation kind of goes hand in hand with it. Naturalistic observation is we're measuring things in the world. Now, naturalistic observation in the narrow sense means I'm going to sit there and watch you and see what you do. But there's a lot of things within that purview. The classic example is pager studies. If you want to find out what somebody's mood is like over time, you give them a pager and you buzz that pager once in a while and you have them write down what they were feeling, and then you come back and look at it, and that gives you a measure over time. One of the things that we find is people are terrible reporters about the past. The truth is, when you ask somebody how you doing, what that question they actually answer is, how have you been in about the past 15 minutes? Using these kinds of systematic observations, you can get past some of those heuristic and perceptual biases and get at the truth of what's going on. One of the big controversial areas examining this was there was a number of studies that found that looked at the connection between people experiencing premenstrual stress and their behaviour. And some of these studies, and there was an awful lot of argument about this, some of these studies were finding that when you separated out the person's attributions about what was going on, when you used this pager method, they found very little evidence for PMS in a general population. Now, that is exactly the kind of controversial statement that's going to get me yelled at, so all I ask is you wait until I get back before you yell at me, and I will be happy to talk about that in more detail if you want to yell at me about it. But, and I should stress, we're talking about aggregation, we're talking about averages over people. That doesn't exclude individual cases where it does happen. Now, those kinds of observations versus experimental data, controllable, measurable. And some of these can be really quite novel. I believe Thunder uses the example, he talks about the Michelle marshmallow study, where they have young children, they give them a marshmallow and they say, okay, we're going to measure you. Well, they don't obviously tell them that we're going to measure your deferred gratification. But they tell them, okay, we're going to give you a marshmallow and we're going to leave you for 5 minutes. And if you've still got the marshmallow when we come back, we'll give you 5 marshmallows. But if you don't, well, then you'll have eaten a nice yummy marshmallow, but you won't get the 5. So just sit here, but remember, if you don't eat it, you get 5 marshmallows when I get back. Leave them, come back in 5 minutes, do what you do. If they've still got it, they get the 5. If they haven't, they don't. And then they track these kids over time and related their performance in tasks to and in life outcomes to their performance on that task. That's, to me, is a pretty interesting idea. Linking and being able to control the situation like that. But in that use of reliability, no matter how novel it is, we lose some of the richness and some of the validity of directly asking people. Again, trade-off. And also some of those answers can be ambiguous. I believe the example that Thunder uses is in the Michelle study, where he talks about, what does that time it take the kid waits mean? Especially in the context of a kid who doesn't like marshmallows. That it might just be that we've picked this group of kids that don't particularly like marshmallows, they're not interested in them, and that deferred gratification isn't really measuring it. We're measuring how long the kid would sit there. We get to what these results actually mean. It can be messy. So, excuse me, 4 general kinds of indicators. We've got self-report, we've got others report, we've got life outcomes, and we've got studies in control conditions. All of them have strengths and weaknesses, and we want to use a variety of those measures, and what we really want to see is We want to see convergence. If I'm looking at a characteristic, if I'm looking at narcissism, a narcissist is a person who is extremely arrogant. They believe the best of themselves, they believe they're special and unique and wonderful, and they're really fun to be around. But you take this narcissistic dude, hopefully he'll tell you he's got high self-esteem. Likely all the people around him will tell you that he's got high self-esteem. He should act in a similar way across situations as having high self-esteem, and outcomes that are related to high self-esteem we should see. When we measure his self-esteem in laboratory controlled conditions, we should see high self-esteem. They should come together, and if they're not coming together, we have to ask, are we measuring this wrong? Or is there something different going on here? So, I want to run with one of these ideas. I want to run with an idea that kind of crosses over a bunch of these different categories. The idea I want to run with is the idea of the lexical hypothesis. What the lexical hypothesis is one of the first ways that we used to study personality. A whole bunch of the academic personality psychology research at the moment is very heavily dependent on math and computers. We're a slave to stats. Now, I do my factor analysis, I throw it in the computer, 20 seconds tops. Even when I was using my old terrible laptop, I could run a factor analysis, it would take 20 minutes, and I could leave it in the lab, go off, come back, and it'd be good. 50 years ago, not so much. 50 years ago, you had to book a computer time in the mainframe. 30 years ago. Before that, you had to do it by hand, and it took months. A lot of the early research kind of looked at some of these ideas in ways that were less mathematical, and that's useful to us because we can play with them a little bit. The idea of the lexical hypothesis is that our lexicon, our vocabulary, our selection of words is there for a reason. If personality is a stable, real, underlying thing, we will be able to see it in our the choices of words, not that we use, but the choices of words that exist in our language. The frequency that they show up, how common they are, the availability of those words should tell us something. And a lot of these studies were composed of people running through dictionaries. Let me give you a parallel example. There's a guy called Paul Ekman. If any of you guys have ever seen the TV show Lie to Me is supposedly based on the life of Paul Ekman. I'm not so sure how. I've seen Paul Ekman, I'll tell you this, he doesn't look like Tim Roth. But before he did lie detection, Ekman worked on emotions. And his work on emotions selected that in terms of basic emotions, there's between 5 and 9 basic emotions that may be universal. You can see them across all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different people. Now, how many words can you think of for anger? Seriously, I want you to say them out loud. Right now. Words for anger. You have 30 seconds. Say them out loud now. Don't yell and act a fool, but say them so that the people around you can hear you saying them. You've got 30 seconds. Ready? Go. Really? Come on. Running dry. A few more seconds, keep going. That's 30 seconds. Hopefully that should have been fairly easy. Now, I want you to think of how many single words, how many words can you use to describe the experience of walking away from an argument and then suddenly realizing the things that you should have said and have them pop into your head and go, I should have said that. If you know the word for that, yell out now, and hopefully everyone around you should at least be a little bit impressed. I only know of one phrase to describe that, and it's in French, and the phrase is l'esprit d'escalier. Forgive my awful pronunciation, which means the spirit of the stairway, because people would have arguments, then they'd walk away down the stairs, and then they'd go, I should have said that. I would argue that the number of words for anger and the number of words for l'esprit d'escalier says something about their relative importance, says something about their relative centrality to human experience. Although l'esprit d'escalier, most people have experienced it in their life, we get angry on a daily basis. That frequency tells us something about importance. So what I'm going to have you guys do is start to generate some lists of words. On your own, I want you to come up with as many words for traits as you can. Traits, I mean stable, internal characteristics that a person could have. I want you to write those down. And in a minute, we're going to have you compare your lists to others, so don't start chatting yet. One of the reasons I'm having you do this is actually evidence-based. One of the problems with brainstorming as an activity is you always get a free rider. If you try and come up with things in groups, there's always one dude who sits at the back and picks his nose and doesn't say anything. So we're going to have each of you guys come up with your lists, and then we're going to do that. So off you go, and I'm going to put about 5 or 10 minutes of blankness here. Okay, guys, you should have quite a few words by now. One thing I want to get you thinking about, how many synonyms do you have? How many words do you have that mean the same or similar things, or mean different degrees of the same thing? That's an interesting thought. So I want you guys to get into groups. And your group should be two to 4 people. If you need to go 1 or 2 above, that's fine, just as long as everybody's pulling their weight. You can't be a group of 1, sorry. The first thing I would like you to do is you're going to introduce yourself to each other, and what I would like you to do is write down each other's names, because when you send the homework to me, I want to know who's working with who. Off you go. Right, secondly, I'm going to have you guys compare your lists. You want to look at, are there any traits that everybody came up with? Are there any traits that only one person came up with? You were the only dude who came up with that. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong, it's just kind of interesting. And what I'm curious, and what I'm going to ask you guys to discuss a little bit, is what patterns do you notice? What things jump out at you? Off you go. Off you go. Congratulations, scientists! As I said, you've just broadly recreated the non-statistical portion of early personality research. Come up with a list of words, look at their relative frequency, argue with each other about it. Good work. So, the written part of this is going to be the second part of homework 1. You should have the first part already from the first class, which was the completion of that personality measure, the IPIP marker test. What I would like you to do is, following the directions that should be on the screen, is add to that the list of characteristics that you came up with, the list of common characteristics for your group, the list of characteristics that everybody or more than one person in the group got. If you had less than 5 common characteristics, 5 is the magic number, if you had less than 5, pick one from your own list. If your group got more than 5, if you got 10 or 15, winnow them down, pick the ones that you like. Pick the 5 most important characteristics. The criteria for this is what you think are the most important, because you're the one who's going to have to make a logical case. Now, I want in no more than 2 pages, double-spaced, and I kind of mean that. I want you to make a case, tell me what your characteristics are, and make a case why they are the big 5. This is practicing logical argument, practicing thinking about things. And so you've got your 5. I want you to tell me why those are the 5 most important characteristics about humanity, about people. We've already hit last week, we touched on the idea of the big 5: neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness and conscientiousness. I want to hear your big 5. I want you to tell me why, arguing across, based on your lexical argument, I want you to tell me why they're the most important. Put part 1 and part A and part B of the homework together, put them all in one document, all in one Word file. It can be a Word, PDF, whatever's good, and email it to me. And as I said, you're going to put per Psy in the subject heading, or personality psychology, something so I know which class you're emailing it to me from. And that'll be your first homework. Doesn't sound too terrible. I'd like to say good work, guys. I will see you guys come next Tuesday. If you have any questions, email them to me. As you guys know, my email is felixbsmith@gmail.com. That's felixbsmith@gmail.com. I will see you guys next week. We'll go from there. Good work, guys.